My name's George Constantine. I am co-chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice Group here at Venable, and we are really pleased to be able to co-sponsor this with Humentum, this event that I think is near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And just based on the showing on a Monday morning here, relatively chilly Monday morning, a pretty full house, and I know we've got some folks on the phone too, so it's great to see such a good crowd. Our nonprofit organizations group is really pleased to sponsor these types of events on a regular basis. We feel it's a part of our obligation to sort of give back to the community, and we do have monthly luncheons. Those of you who may not be familiar, let Camille know. We can get your name in on a list to get you invited to those as well. A very premier sort of a top-notch practice on nonprofit organizations. We have a new addition just 2 weeks earlier who joined us from AARP, Cindy Lewin, who is now reaching for something she dropped on the floor. Please stand and be recognized, Cindy. Our former general counsel of AARP recently came over. So excited to have Cindy on and joining a team of 20 or so lawyers we have here who practice regularly on nonprofit issues. So again, thanks. That's enough of our little commercial. I'm going to go through and introduce very briefly our panelists. And I believe on your tables is a more sort of thorough bio for each of them. So I don't mean to give them short shrift. I just want to save some time here. We'll start to my immediate left, and that's Andrew Steinberg, an associate here at Venable. Andrew's been a colleague of mine for a few years now and has done great work on all sorts of nonprofit organization issues, including specific to this event. Transactional work on mergers, acquisitions, affiliations between nonprofit organizations both domestically and internationally, and has done tremendous amount of service for our clients in that and other areas. So Andrew will serve as our moderator today. To Andrew's left is Rebecca Kohler. Rebecca is Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Development for IntraHealth out of Chapel Hill. Rebecca provides vision and leadership for the successful execution of alliances and achievement of revenue goals. Over a 25-year career devoted to fostering solutions to healthcare challenges, Rebecca has held key leadership, management, technical, and advisory positions in the U.S. and around the world. A seasoned global health practitioner, Rebecca has hands-on experience working on HIV/AIDS, reproductive health, safe motherhood, and child survival programs in more than 20 countries across several continents. So, welcome, Rebecca. Next to Rebecca is Steve Hollingsworth. Steve is President and CEO of Grameen Foundation. Steve's unflagging commitment through 30 years of work in international development has been to ensure that the delivery of financial services benefits to the world's poorest people and fulfill its promises of alleviating poverty. Prior to joining Grameen Foundation, Steve was President of Freedom from Hunger. Beginning in 2011, he focused that organization on the intersection of financial services and ending hunger through the empowerment of women in rural communities. Previously, he served as Chief Operating Officer for CARE. Next to Steve, my list isn't in order as you see it here, so I have to Tom Dente, our co-sponsor today. He's President and CEO of Humentum. Tom, thank you very much for being a co-sponsor. Tom is an executive and strategic leader who offers a record of achievement leading transformational efforts that allow corporations and nonprofit organizations to fulfill their vision for continued success. Leveraging his extensive consulting background and more recently his work with Humentum, Tom excels at conceptualizing and driving the delivery of strategies and operating plans that allow organizations to meet their full potential. Welcome, Tom. And finally, Mark Viso, President and CEO of Pact. Mark is building on Pact's past to shape a future for the organization centered on locally designed solutions, partnerships, and measurable impact. Under Mark's leadership, Pact has established itself as a preferred partner for national aid agencies and corporations and embraced an integrated approach to development, one that blends improvements in governance, markets, local capacity, health, livelihoods, and natural resource management. Before joining Pact in 2009, Mark served as Senior Vice President for International Programs at World Learning. As you'll see very quickly as we go through this program, each of these individuals has very personal, recent experience on the topic of the day, and I think you'll really benefit from hearing from them directly. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew. And again, thank you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you, George, and good morning, everyone. We'll dive right into this, and we'll use the next hour and a half or so to explore how nonprofits, especially in the humanitarian and development space, can use mergers and affiliations as an effective tool to achieve your goals, advance your missions, and most importantly, increase your impact. And that begs the question, what is a merger and what is an affiliation? I think for the purposes of today's discussion, we'll just use it as a generic term that means the combination of one or more organizations, either functionally or legally, but generally mergers can be a full-blown legal combination or something short of that. As we'll hear today, mergers take different forms and don't necessarily follow a set course, and we'll be using our time to highlight the diverse paths that NGOs took to arrive at positive outcomes. We'll also understand the thorny issues that can arise during the merger and affiliation process and learning how these issues have been successfully resolved. And most importantly, we'll raise awareness and educate you about different kinds of merger strategies so as to encourage you to seriously examine the potential to help your own organizations become stronger and more effective enterprises. As housekeeping matters, if you could just turn your cell phones off or to silent, that would be great. And we'll have microphones roving throughout, and feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Just raise your hand and someone will come over. And to those of you who are joining us by webinar, feel free to submit a question by chat, and my colleague Camille will be passing questions up to me. So let's jump right in. And what brought you here today, and where are you in your merger and affiliation process? Rebecca, do you want to kick us off?
No problem. Can you hear my mic? Can you hear now?
Sure, Mark, do you want to?
Oh, sure. Just because of technical difficulty, now you start. Nicely played, Rebecca. First, Venerable Humentum Tom, thank you, George. Thank you for having us. It's a great space, as you all can see. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. Pact has been involved in several types of mergers, affiliations over the last couple of years. One, we have the subsidiaries in the process of being acquired. We're forming and working with Venerable, forming a joint venture with a UK technology firm. Those are a couple of things, but the two that Venerable asked me to talk about was a merger/acquisition with a Canadian-based company called Artisanal Gold Council that just recently ended, which did not consummate. And part of our global governance model restructuring, an affiliate we started a little over a year ago in the United Kingdom called Pact UK. Why did we do both of those things? Well, we look at both Pact UK and Artisanal Gold Council as an opportunity to enter new markets that we're not in or that we tried to be in and didn't do so well at, or to acquire new skills, talents, capacities, or even mindsets that were hard to cultivate internally. And when we look at trying to do those two things, we look at three options. We're going to either buy, merge, acquire, build internally, organically, or intentionally, or partner, some degree of affiliation. So with Artisanal Gold Council, which did not work out, which we'll talk more about when we get to the lessons section, it was really to extend our competency and capacity in extractive industries, subsoil commodities, minerals, tin, tungsten, tantalum, cobalt, to an area that's very specialized, gold, that has really not done a lot in terms of improving its value chain or supply chain in a way that can improve people's lives that are involved in it, particularly with mercury or child labor, those types of things. And so it would be difficult for us to build that capacity internally, though we could do it. And so we thought the best way to do it was find a premier organization that works similar to us with artisanal and small-scale miners, not large-scale miners. It's our niche. And find a way to bring their competencies in and have our competencies complement them, not really suck them in, but find a way to have this merger, 1 + 1 = 2. How to do that. That was very much a tactical and opportunistic move for us. We can talk about that in the lessons. Pact UK is a byproduct of us taking a more strategic, intentional, and planned approach to how do we want to expand into new markets, and designating what are those markets and how do we enter them and how do we play in them for a little while until we decide should we buy, build, or partner. And so Pact UK, we formed an affiliate, Pact UK, just separately registered charity under charitable corporate law. It's a new designation in the UK called charitable corporation. And so we have stood that up a little over a year now. We can talk about lessons there about span of control and what that looks like. So that's where we are. The Artisanal Gold Council, Didn't work out, and we can talk about that. Pact UK is going. It is now net positive. It's returning net profit to the global enterprise. That's that's brought us here.
Good. Well, just before I do start, I do want to thank George and Andrew and the Venable team. Again, thank you for hosting us in this fantastic space and convening us around these important topics. Again, just to quickly set the context for Humentum. Humentum was formed of 3 different organizations, Inside NGO, Lingos, and a UK-based organization called Mango. Each of these organizations served the broader international development and humanitarian sector in different ways. Inside NGO was a membership-based organization focused on a lot of operational areas and both training around operational areas as well as convening communities of practice. Lingos focused on the evolution of learning across our sector. How do you make learning more accessible, more scalable, and more relevant to different audiences around the world? And then Mango historically had focused on providing financial management services from consulting to training so that NGOs of all different types can be more effective in how they use their funding. So each of our 3 organizations served slightly different but related parts of our sector. And as we started our conversations, one of the things that we saw was a sector that was changing. We saw new pressures. We saw pressures around funding, pressures around operating models, pressures around how do we respond to localization, pressures around how do we reskill for a future which is going to be very different. And somewhat independently, each of us looked at the same sets of conditions and began some conversations to say, if we were to merge and form a new organization, could we accelerate our value to the sector? Could we accelerate the set of services that we offer? And that's what led us to forming Humentum over just about a year-plus process. And I think what made that easier, and we'll talk more about this as we get into some of the details, is we have worked with each other individually over the years, just like all of you collaborate across the sector. So I think having worked together, we had a certain rapport, we respected each other's work, we trusted each other, and I think that helped set the stage for us to think about this broader move, this 1 + 1 + 1 = more than 3 move that we took on. And so we announced, as many of you know, in midsummer, right before the annual conference, that we had merged to form Humentum. And we're about month 5 into post-merger integration. So happy to talk about that as well, because it's great to set up these organizations. It's great to have this vision, but then how do you begin to put this into practice? How do you make sure you're really delivering the value? And how do you balance all the competing needs as you're in different months of integration and changing, your organization for the future? So anyway, we're excited to be here and share our story. And thank you, because a lot of you have supported us as we've gone through this journey.
Great. Well, thanks so much for hosting us again. I'm very fortunate to carry forward the legacy of the Grameen movement in Bangladesh and Professor, Muhammad Yunus. That's essentially our heritage and, the affiliations that we enjoy. So a real key part of the DNA of Grameen and Professor Yunus really is I think a very expansive view towards affiliations. There are about 40 different Grameen entities in Bangladesh alone. The largest by far and away is Grameen Phone. They're the largest cell phone provider in Bangladesh. And you almost name the sector from healthcare to IT to agriculture, Grameen in Bangladesh has an entity. And, Professor Yunus has been, I think, very visionary about encouraging other affiliations all over the world. I'm often confused with Grameen America, which is our sister agency that only works within the U.S. The Grameen Foundation essentially is a replicator of, initially, of Grameen Bank microfinance methodology. But our work now is essentially how the mobile money platform, it opens up financial inclusion opportunities, particularly for poor women, in enterprise, in agriculture, and in healthcare. That's basically our focus. And how data that can be pushed and pulled to and from clients basically can complement the ongoing support that goes on to very poor people. So that's our work. So affiliations are a real key part of what we do and have been for some time. Affiliations, not only of programs that we may be executing that become equity investments for us in a variety of countries. Spin-offs, we have spin-offs that have resulted in not-for-profit entities, groups like MIFOS, or most recently the Progress Out of Poverty Index is now at IPA. And we also have spin-offs that are designed specifically to be social enterprises. The best-known one is a group called TaroWorks, which is a field force management tool that Grameen 100% owns. It's basically a Salesforce backbone that has a front-end application that can be adapted by organizations to manage their field force and to give them data. So that's really kind of the environment that I come into in Grameen. And some of it is grant related, some of it's related to investing, impact investing, social enterprises that we have. And on the merger side, I was very fortunate to be the president of a fantastic group called Freedom from Hunger, which was for many years really a leader in very pro-poor focused microfinance. For those of you who are not kind of in the microfinance debate as much as I've been able to over the last few years, there's a little bit of a fork in the road about agencies that really are trying to find where there is significant white space for serving very poor clients, and organizations that may be viewing it as much more of a commercial activity. Freedom from Hunger has always had the focus on the very poor, as has Grameen. And I was very fortunate to get to know the work of Grameen while being in Freedom from Hunger, being a close sister organization. And when I was approached by the Grameen board to consider the position at Grameen, and I told the Freedom from Hunger board, the Freedom from Hunger board very kindly said, "Well, we'd like to go along with you." So I'm 2 years now with the Grameen Foundation. The first year was essentially designing and negotiating the terms of the merger. This last year has been executing it. We're really done now. You're never done from a cultural perspective. You still have folks use language like old Grameen or old Freedom from Hunger, right? And we'll get there as time passes, I believe. But from the point of view of the systems, our engagement to the outside world, the way we pull together the board and the leadership team, the work is done, and not without its hiccups, but it's been very, very fruitful. A lot of opportunities have been opened up. The way we can use technology more broadly, not just for extension workers or for clients, but also as an educational tool. That's been a big contribution from Freedom from Hunger. And rigor in evaluative work is something else that Freedom from Hunger brought. But there's a lot more to tell there. So.
Yes, now I'm on, I hope. Yeah, okay. Great. I also want to thank Venable for hosting us and Tom at Humentum for really being a forum for these discussions for many years now, and we appreciate that. So I represent IntraHealth International, and I thought I would speak a little bit about sort of how we got to where we are with this affiliation. We're also only 3 months into post-affiliation and a lot to work out. But there has been a long history leading up to it. And really, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I think many of our the environment shifting so much and the volatility of it, and having a business model, IntraHealth International is actually a 40-odd year organization that's had multiple different organizational structures. It started out for the first 20-odd years as a department of the UNC, University of North Carolina School of Medicine. And then in 2003, we became an independent not-for-profit and had been going along quite well. And in 2003 till now, we know that rapid uptake of global health funding and global funding in general, so we did quite well. But over the last 4 or 5 years with this volatility, we had a I guess management and board, but really board kind of worrying about the future. So we began the process of looking at inorganic growth. I mean, we, as an organization that's largely USAID funded, and have been successful at getting other grants as well from foundations and otherwise, we do suffer from not having any source of revenue other than no other unrestricted net assets, no other way to generate fees or capital to invest in growth and really diversification. So that was had a period of, we actually did acquire a very small startup in 2012, a West Coast tech firm, and we were quite excited about that. That was our first, and we thought we'd be looking at acquiring smaller firms and kind of growing that way. But a couple of initiatives didn't really pan out, and I think our board started getting a little more nervous about the future. And about a year and a half ago, we decided, board and management, that we felt like aligning with, in some way, with either medium, similar size or a larger organization was the way to go. We knew there were a couple of things when we set out that we were looking for. We wanted to be aligning, and we didn't know whether it was merger, acquisition, affiliation, but we knew some sort of ground rules that we wanted to put in place. We were definitely looking for an organization that was complementary to ours in terms of outside the health sector. With the environment of the SDGs, we know that there's just a lot of interest in trying to solve problems multi-sectorally. We're also interested in an organization that had different markets, different funding streams, different ways of business that we could benefit from. We also wanted an organization that did have access to either credit facilities or some kinds of ways that we could think about generating new product lines, new types of work. And then lastly, of course, as we've heard before, having to an organization that was in alignment of our mission and our values. We also set about with some givens as an organization. We wanted to make sure that we maintained our brand, we maintained our name, our mission, and the kinds of projects and partnerships that we had, our current safeguard, our current programs. So we set about a process of about a year long looking at different organizations and landed with DAI, and we're very excited about DAI. And going in, we didn't know how a nonprofit and a for-profit would come together that easily, and didn't see a lot of models for that externally. Usually for-profits create their own non-for-profits, not necessarily come together. It's still a work in progress, still lots happening. I think with DAI, I know you all know them because they are obviously one of the biggest USAID contractors in our space. One of the things we're really excited about is, of course, they're known not so much in health, but in other sectors, and particularly sectors that do impinge some on health, like governance and economic growth. And also, they have a real strong entrepreneurial spirit. They've been involved in the GDA, the Global Development Alliances with aid, the early kind of pre-development lab, and have been very involved in the developmental lab and lots of other ways. They also move very quickly. They see opportunities and they seize them. They kind of are quick in the market. And then they also just, as some of you may know, that just a couple years ago, they created their own global health subsidiary and hired a new vice president, a new division, and that's the division where we're linking up with. So they're, definitely investing heavily in health. So we are working. Clearly the affiliation at the start is really around the governance structure, and some of the details about how we operate day to day are still being worked out. But I can certainly go more into some of those issues in the Q&A.
Sure. So I actually want to come back to you, Rebecca. You made a great point about the criteria for how you went about identifying a potential partner for an affiliation. But how'd you actually go about initiating a discussion to affiliate? And
well, certainly. How many people have had other CEOs call them about having conversations? Most people. So my president, Pop Guy, has initiated and has just, in the forums where we engage, lots of conversations take place about what are you doing, how are you managing this situation, this volatility, or what are you thinking about mergers and acquisitions? So a lot of it is tiptoeing kinds of conversations. Sometimes it gets misconstrued, like what is this conversation really about? So we got a sense then of the kinds of organizations that were active. And DAI, for example, we have had kind of typical partner relationships with them over the years and had bid together on U.S. government procurements a little bit, not a lot. I mean, they're not really known in the health sector. Their new VP for their health division is Chris LeGrand. I think some of you know him. He happens to, and he started about 2 years ago, he happens to live in North Carolina. And so we had a prior relationship with them, so that was sort of how they came about. And some of the others, you know, again, similarly, conversations at fora like this and others where get a sense of the, you know, who's looking. One of the things that happened to IntraHealth, which was certainly a point of inflection and disruption for us, is we, as I said, we've largely USAID funded, largely cooperative agreements. One of our largest instruments, it made up about 10% of our revenue, but it was very important to us. We lost that project. So as soon as you lose a big project, you know, the wolves come and like start asking you, are you going to survive? What are you doing? And so I think that, and we've actually since then really, we're now larger than we were before. So we felt that this was a good time because it was from a position of strength. Too often mergers come about when you're in a position of weakness and you're like selling off assets. And we felt like that could happen in 3 or 4 years given where the field is going, but it wasn't where we were now, and we wanted to be able to secure our mission and the programs that we feel are unique in what we offer.
Turning from the internal decision to go externally, how did you come back to your volunteer leadership, to the others on an executive management team, and to your staff about approaching a perspective of merger or affiliation transaction? And this question's for anyone up here.
You know, like as I mentioned, you know, I was very fortunate. Grameen Foundation and Freedom from Hunger are part of a, you know, a very close coordinating body that works with you know, the microfinance sector. So there was a lot of, you know, technical back and forth. And you know, I was fortunate when I announced to the board of Freedom from Hunger that I wanted to go. They were willing to explore it. You know, it is partly assessing, you know, the various kind of interests and motivations of key stakeholders. I mean, that's really the root of it. And, you know, I had the expression of intent and interest from the Freedom from Hunger side. The main issue, of course, that I had with the Grameen board was, you know, I basically had to get the job, right? And I had to win their, you know, their confidence, right, that I was the right candidate for their organization, right? And then, you know, and then introduce, you know, the idea of a merger to it. So, you know, at the board, I mean, I think, you know, apart from the insecurity that lots of boards feel now about, you know, the strength of organizations, which is a reality, you know, boards largely come from a commercial world where, you know, these kinds of things are part of their daily, you know, diet. They got it very quickly. So, you know, that stakeholder, I think, was the first, the joint boards was the first one really to pay attention to, make sure that they were on side with it. They could help form it. That was a key. You know, and then you go to other stakeholders, you know, the external donor community. I think, you know, the international donor community, the bilaterals and whatnot, I think they get it. I think they understand, you know, what benefits can be had from it. And the individual donors, the small grant donors, the major gifts donors for organizations, a little bit more problematic, right? Many of them have been, you know, concerned, for example, that the hunger aspect that Freedom from Hunger brought in remains, or that the name, you know, that had been there for 70 years as an organization is going away. So that's required, you know, specific attention. You know, our country programs were a key stakeholder in it because, you know, we're really moving now towards branding, you know, every office under the Grameen Foundation as Grameen Foundation. You know, that's jolting for some people, you know, who've been in country programs for years and years and years in one way. So, you know, integrating them into what the legacy of Grameen is and how valuable it is. It's been easier in Asia and East Africa, harder in Latin America, where, you know, where the Grameen bank brand isn't quite as well known. Staff really, staff are our main stakeholders. Let's face it. In the not-for-profit world, we're not paying anybody dividends, and we're employing people to pursue the mission and asking them to sacrifice a great deal. And that's I think the main rub area, the main area that takes time, to kind of educate folks about the advantages of the merger. Of course, the other reality behind a real merger is a loss of staff, right? Because you're combining functions, and you do lose people, and that's a difficult thing, frankly. So
let's talk about naming and branding in the course of a merger and affiliation transaction. Each one of your organizations had a different approach to naming. In the case of IntraHealth, both organizations who affiliated retained their separate entities. In the case of Grameen, the Grameen name took hold. And in the case of now Humentum, there were two other organizations which have now all shed their identities to come under a new umbrella. And Tom, could you just perhaps go into that process and how you approach the branding discussion?
I think as we were, when we started this back in the good old days of March 2016, one of the things we determined very early on we had a task force made up of the CEOs of each of the organizations, plus 2 board members, that in order to truly create this new merged organization, we will have to create a new identity, create a new branding around this organization. And to do that, it's a nice combination of aspirational and reality. And so we worked with a branding consultant, very good, came up with a number of names, a namescape. We would evaluate these names. We'd get very excited about something. And then we'd turn it over to the lawyers. And the lawyers would say, gee, you can't use that. Amazon has trademarked that. And we said, Amazon, surely we can strike a deal. No. But so you have this, this interplay of aspiration and what's possible. And as we went through this process, we went through a number of names, but we really spent a lot of time saying, how do we have this new identity really help to tell our story? And so when we landed on Humentum, what that meant for us was momentum for humanity, what a lot of our sector does, creating momentum for greater human goals. And for us, it also means, human capabilities drive momentum in our sector. And we spend a lot of time supporting human capabilities across a wide range of functional areas and capabilities. So we wanted to be able to tell our new story around our name that would resonate with people. Because if you think about a brand, what's a brand? It's trust. It's affiliation. It's identity. And we wanted to have, a brand that we could fill that in over time with stories and with examples that really would bring that concept to life.
If I could just follow up on your first question,
sure,
and tie it to what Tom was saying, I think it's right. How do you get the various stakeholders to want to go along for the journey? So for us, we did a couple things. Even though I mentioned the AGC, Artisanal Gold Council, was tactical and opportunistic, we were able to pursue it that way because we had put a framework with our board to allow us to do it like that. So first and foremost, I think we went on a 2-year journey to have a new strategy. It didn't look at mergers and acquisitions as an input, but what did we want to look like? And we took a look at the organization, and we've mapped it and say, what are our assets? So it was an asset map approach. And then how do we operationalize, how do we optimize the assets we currently have, incremental innovation? And how do we reconfigure those assets or acquire new assets? And I use the term asset very broadly speaking, capacities, not necessarily an organization, that are next adjacent ones, and then when you put them into the orbit, put them into the ecosystem, that leverages the whole ecosystem, and all assets are greater. So getting the board to buy into that and officially approve that strategy allowed us to do 2 things. One, pursue things opportunistically, like the Artisanal Gold Council, without having, so we didn't really talk, we just sort of told the board we were doing this, but until it really is ready to get the lawyers involved and money goes out the door, we didn't necessarily involve the board because it was this overall construct of this management had not only that permission, but in fact that responsibility to leverage and redefine assets and how they work with each other. With Pact UK, it was very much an intentional part of our overall global governance construct. And so the board was involved in that. Because and we can talk about it later, but when you form another organization, another jurisdiction like the United Kingdom that has very particular laws, you do not control that entity. And yet you'd like to control parts of that entity. And that makes boards nervous when you are the one investing all the money, very dear, unrestricted money, for something that you're going to grow that you don't control. We don't even appoint the CEO. It doesn't work for me. Depends on who you ask. So that's the trouble. I think the way we got there was two things. One, first and foremost, we looked at our main shareholders. So part of our global governance construct that they voted on in November was that we don't see the people we serve as beneficiaries or stakeholders. We see them as shareholders. In other words, it's a slight linguistic change. I think it's, in terms of value and orientation, a revolutionary understanding of how you derive value for your organization. And we think we measure our worth as an organization by, are we providing value to our shareholders, the people we serve? So they own us. And we won't bore you, but we're working with Venable on what is an actual teeth to that. What does that look like? How do they have decision rights? These are the 2.7 million people that we serve. Hard to get your head around. So that was the first thing we did. When you make that shift, then this next thing we had to do was to make sure that any merger, acquisition, affiliation, or startup, or even when we dispose of an asset, which we are doing, is how does doing so propel the mission and the values of the organization? And you develop actual measurable criteria around that. We have a score. There's a score, right? And so when we were looking to dispose of an asset, we're in that process right now. Certain people who would have been more friendly to that particular activity from a business or financial perspective scored less because they weren't mission aligned or value aligned. And value is a little squishier than mission, right? Second, then you look at it from business terms. And we have some hard metrics on business terms. That's when the lawyers come involved. That's when, and so we got help. We have Accenture working with us. We have you guys working with us. We have lawyers in the UK. So that's kind of how we move that. We created this construct focused on who we are. We're not a for-profit. Mission and values, and somehow quantify that, almost monetize mission and value, and that allows everybody to get on the same page. At least they can know what they're disagreeing with. And then when you get to brand, it becomes less of an issue. That's our experience anyway.
How do you straddle the line between the use of outside advisors and knowing when sometimes maybe the best approach is internally within the organization and having a business-to-business conversation? How do you tiptoe that balance between relying on outside advisors and using your own intuition and moving ahead?
Well, intuition's always dangerous, right? But we're human, so we always are led by it, at least initially, and that's what we did initially. You know, I think I like what you say, you tiptoe around the conversation. What are you talking about? For the Artisanal Gold Council, we had a lunch meeting with the founder and his COO, and my COO and some folks there are talking. Finally, I just said, are we talking about a merger and acquisition? I mean, and so I think in the beginning, as long as you know that for not-for-profit, mission and values are your key criteria, and you have some actual rigorous metrics to understand that. So you're not arguing, euphemistically, but you're arguing about real measurable things. You're arguing about the merits of the case around mission and values, not around business. Then I think you start. You start with those conversations. You start with intuition. I tell you, the reason why the Artisanal Gold Council failed was we had Accenture come in, we had Venable come in. So at a certain point, about 1/3 of the way through, we invited people in. So we had conversations because it's people, particularly when dealing with founders, right? I always like to say, and I could be wrong, but my sense is in our sector, not-for-profit sector, the currency of mergers and acquisitions is ego and reputation. Since we don't have stakeholders, no one's getting dividends. That's what it is. So we should say that, and so you should operate that way. And until you've got those massaged enough so people are comfortable, then you bring in the help, right? Because, no disrespect, but y'all don't care about that so much. Y'all care about the precedents, the legal stuff, and trying to protect us. Amen to that. So what it didn't work in our Artisanal Gold Council, we underestimated those two things. We thought we were all on the same page, and we underestimated the value of intuition past the 1/3 where we were doing that it needs to carry all the way through. And that's where we didn't quite make it.
Well, I think there were also sometimes certain misperceptions about what a merger or affiliation was. Tom, could you perhaps comment?
Just one quick add to that, and I really appreciate Mark's conversation. In our first meeting, we knew that there were two things we had to sort out. One was, if we did this, what's the mission? And so we, did good work collectively, this board task force and the 3 CEOs saying, what is the mission of this combined organization? What could it be? Because without that agreement on mission and values, it's hard to go forward at that point. And then the second thing was to say, is this collaboration or is this merger? And we made a decision at that point to say, let's go for merger because we think we can do more on that mission. And if we can't, for whatever reason, we run into roadblocks down the way, we can back into another form of collaboration. But the fear was that if we just started off with a series of collaborations, it's going to absorb a lot of organizational time and attention, and we may never get there because of inertia and other factors around control and putting the resources in the right place. So those two decisions at that first session really helped guide how we would advance ahead.
So a lot of the time in mergers and affiliations, apart from name changes and apart from perhaps unification of missions or modifications to missions, there are also changes in governance structure and the governance organs. And Steve, could you comment perhaps on how Grameen went about having the discussions with its own leadership about what the future of the organization would look like and who was going to move forward and maybe who was going to go off into retirement?
Right. Well, there's two levels to it, really. One is decisions made, for continuity on the board and roles on the board, and then, the second is essentially organizational leadership. I was very fortunate, frankly, to have a board that was very committed to mission, very knowledgeable about both organizations and both sectors, and as I mentioned, very open to, the idea of merging. Of course, it was highly beneficial to Grameen by acquiring a really very capable organization that had a great country footprint, particularly in West Africa and Latin America, and it was very kind of beneficial to Freedom from Hunger because, frankly, the Grameen brand and coming under the the Professor Yunus kind of network was seen as being very attractive. So the boards were aligned, and both boards had, I think, a very good succession, kind of planning. So there were board classes and board members graduating off in a planned way. And essentially, the board went to a year of having co-chairs of the overall board and co-chairs of each of the major committees, and an executive committee that was blended between the two organizations. We were able to take the succession planning work and basically determine which classes would stay and which ones wouldn't, and match that against our geographic diversity and kind of skills requirements that we had. So that went very well, and frankly, the board did an awful lot of organizing itself in that area. Mark's point about leadership, it really is, I think, like the $100 million question in all of this. There's no payout for anybody going from being the CEO of a not-for-profit. That's not what happens. You're not bought out and sent to Malibu or whatever. Maybe that'll change, but. And so, I was very fortunate, and it was, I think, a big assistance in the whole process of being one CEO for both organizations. Right now, I was really blessed by having an executive vice president in Freedom from Hunger who had been there for many years, who was really planning her own retirement and succession, who saw the wisdom of it and basically became a very important internal champion for the Freedom from Hunger staff, right, to this, because that's a big consideration. And she really, went above and beyond to make it happen, and, really deserves a huge amount of thanks for what she did. But there were, I know, and, I'm not telling things out of church here, but I think 10, 12 years before I joined Grameen Foundation, there were discussions between Freedom from Hunger and Grameen, and I think the same issue came up about who was going to be the CEO and what was going to be the future, and that's the stickler in a big way. And then from the CEO, how you sort out the other executive management and how you bring everybody else on board. So to me, the linchpin was having the very solid support of the board to do it. Right, that was key, because if you had fissures there or fractures in that discussion, you're in big trouble, right? And then second was having an advocate within Freedom from Hunger who could have had the perception that as staff they were losing out by losing their brand and losing their kind of market recognition, et cetera, but having a very key supporter in that. I mentioned before, we're not through this yet. Culturally, it's still difficult for people, as you scale back activities in one geography that maybe impacts the old organization, or, you have to make choices about where, you invest and where you don't invest, and it can be, seen by legacy staff through that lens. I mean, that's there, but through time and I think, we've tried to, really kind of expand the way we talk about how we're coming together. We've rebranded, to really reflect the mission of both organizations. You get through it, but I think really the big issue that we avoided in many ways was the winners and losers in the CEO executive team level.
So let's talk about the integration of culture. Sure.
Say, you asked earlier about the brand. And,
sure, Rebecca.
That we all have different, and we kept our name. One of the things that is certainly characteristic of the not-for-profit sector is probably a deeper, relative to for-profit, which is where we're interacting now, certainly has a strong, we probably have more staff, more attention, more different types of stakeholders. So our brand and our communications tends to be, we invest in it more, and it tends to be really important. And one of the things that at IntraHealth, we have done a lot of aligning and partnerships in alliances and in coalitions. So the idea of how to protect your brand in that environment is something that we've learned a lot of lessons over the years. And we do manage very carefully our sub-brands, as it were. Sometimes our sub-brands are large global projects that we might implement. Sometimes they might be consortiums that we're leading. Some of them might be some of our products. So how does people know about mHero, for example? I don't know if you've heard about mHero, and used in the Ebola context, as a tech tool. How do we were involved in, we created it, and with UNICEF, not everybody knows, for example, that IntraHealth is the creator of it. So how do we manage those brands? And I think one of the things that we feel going forward, and things could change over the years, but not necessarily in the next couple of years, is this idea, maybe taking more from the for-profit sector, of this idea of you keeping your name because it's so well known. And it's not just, your name is not, and your brand is not just your name and your logo. There's a lot of things behind that. And we have a very strong branding team. And one of the things that they, particularly even coming up to me, seeing me as critical to this, and they report up through me, and they were very worried that we were going to lose our name. And they said, look, in the for-profit sector, for example, Ben & Jerry's, Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, but nobody knows that. Ben & Jerry's is a brand, and it means something, and it's been, they've been part of Unilever for a number of years, and so they, subsidiaries and organizations that are sort of owned and controlled by others can certainly have as much sort of arm's length autonomy as you would like to give it, and the importance of keeping the name. And I don't know, for example, the Freedom from Hunger kind of did some sort of analysis of, what is that value of the brand, and what does it mean to lose it? So I think for us, it was critical for that, and DAI is supportive of that. I think there's things that they certainly are wanting out of the affiliation, but they also recognize that IntraHealth as a brand has a value.
How do you manage the integration of cultures between a nonprofit and a for-profit organization? You touched on that briefly.
Well, one of the things we're really thrilled to learn about over time, and I think we all have, the nonprofit, I wouldn't say IntraHealth specifically, but as a whole, we have a perception of what the kind of beltway bandwidths, the for-profits in our sector, how they operate, and some of them are some actions of large for-profits do counter sort of the values that we at least espouse as a community. But we were very thrilled to feel and see that first and foremost, DAI is a development firm, and very committed to the work. They are also, here a little bit, I want to represent DAI here because I'm not really able to do that, but they are an employee-owned company. That means a lot to them, and I think that element, and having, they have an incredible longevity of a lot of their staff as well, and they're just in the business of doing their good work. And so we found really close alignment with in values. More personally, having worked mostly in the not-for-profit sector, was pleasantly surprised to see that.
What were some of the biggest obstacles that you encountered in consummating your transaction? Was there anything similar in terms of the integration of cultures?
Yeah, no, I think less obstacles and more things we wanted to pay special attention to. And I think part of it was we wanted to create one organization. And so I think putting together our new senior leadership team as early as possible. In fact, even before we had consummated the merger, just so that we could start to operate as a team and then guide the change, because, that would be an important role for us. I think Rebecca talked a lot about culture. Culture was very important for us. One of the exercises we did very early on, again, even before, when we were still figuring out terms and conditions and how it would come together, was with a bit of humor, was tell me your stereotype of each other's culture. So you can imagine this exercise where different representatives from our 3 organizations are together saying, so what do you think of Inside NGO? What do you think of Lingos? What do you think of Mango? And in the humor and bringing out the stereotypes, it kind of surfaced some issues that we knew we'd have to wrestle with as we started to come together as an organization. And it's something that you're never done with, that we think, culture requires, the involvement of everyone on our team, because culture is values in action. And we've had a lot of efforts, and we'll continue to involve our whole organization in helping to define the culture that allows us to meet our mission and then to reach our own potential as employees of Humentum. So there's a lot in that. So I think focus on organization so we can get that right, focus on the culture, and then more importantly, balance, because think about this. It's like integration can take up all of your time if you let it. And for us, very deliberately, we said, we have to box integration, because think about it. In each of your organizations, you have things you haven't addressed, systems issues, people issues, other kinds of design or strategy issues. If you put all that into integration, you may never be done. And so for us, we said we have to scope integration very carefully so that we can continue to add value externally. Because what we didn't want to do was be distracted from, our service to the sector in this time. So that was probably the other watch out for us, is let's make sure we put integration in the right box so that it doesn't become the thing.
How do you set timetables for integration and stick to them? That's for
Same follow-up question. Okay, I think for us it was we started July 1st, and we used July 1st to October 1st as a set of milestones. And I think it was helpful because it puts emphasis around different points in time, and we can communicate those. And it was all about how do we create one Humentum, how do we demonstrate new value externally. Those 2 aspects really drove some of the integration. We also thought a lot about pacing. So, for example, we have not taken on, and I look across this room and think about a lot of your organizations, we haven't taken on the bigger systems issues yet. We're just starting to do that. So we paced organization and culture first, and then we're going to pick up systems and some of the other aspects of integration. So for us it was, let's not, again, overwhelm the organization. Let's keep our focus and let's pace this appropriately. And it sounds like, Steve, you're about a year into yours, and I think, thinking about this is, what do we do the first year and where do we want to be at the end of the first year? And let's not take on everything at once. So let's pace this through. I'm curious if you had some.
Right. Yeah, no, very much. I mean, ours all happened, October 15 was the board decision to do it. And then basically we had a 9-month plan turn into a year's plan because things get delayed, of course. Right. And, the first emphasis was basically clarity on management and leadership structure. That was, the first set of big announcements. And then, similarly, we tried to keep the pedal to the metal on our, on our execution programs, our fundraising efforts. And, really the first kind of functional integration that we had was in our use of Salesforce, for example, for our institutional donor grants and for our small sum and large donors. with a deliberate outreach in particular to, very loyal supporters about what was going on, why it was going on, et cetera. And then, it really has been over the last few months that, we've been able to finalize things like the financial system or, the human resources, the ADP, universal use. But we had a great plan, and, different units were responsible for it and reporting back. Of course it slips, but the fact that we're done now with the systems integration, and the cultural integration is, it's just a constant, frankly. We try to use our monthly all staff meetings that are global now, but basically is to always have like a mission moment where people can have a better understanding of what may be happening in one part of the organization against another that they didn't understand before. We have an annual meeting. The first one was a very important one that brought together, all of our staff from the two organizations. But, that's just a continual work in progress. But we did have a good plan that I think we followed through on pretty well.
I did want to turn to our audience for a moment and see if anyone has any questions that they want to ask. Camille and Jessica are going to come around.
Sorry. Okay. It needs to be. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Hi. Good morning. Thank you so much for the panel this morning. It's been really great. My name is Amy Kokenauer. I'm with NCBA CLUSA, and I have two questions. Two-part question. One is, what is the thing that surprised you the most about going through this process? And what is the one thing that you would do differently, knowing what you know now?
Mark, you want to start?
Well, that's a great question. If we knew the answers to that before we started, it'll go good. So, yeah, we're involved in several different ones, so it's hard to pull. They're all different. But if I try to give a couple specifics and some general thoughts, one, I was surprised how long it takes. So this acquisition that we're having one of our subsidiaries be acquired, it's been going on 18 months, and we're not there yet, even in terms of the agreement. All very reasonable stuff. It just takes a long time, right? And so as the parent organization plans, so it's not just about that particular exchange, that transaction, it affects the other parts of the business, right? So, and even with the Artisanal Gold Council, which is very small, they're about $8-9 million a year, it took a long time, a lot of conversations. I was surprised about that. What I'd do different is, for example, on the specific of the Artisanal Gold Council, we probably wouldn't invest as much as we did. We paid for them to fly here. We paid for their time to negotiate with us, which I'm thinking, only in the not-for-profit world do you pay somebody to negotiate, because we're all good people. So we probably wouldn't do that again. And I think we would get help a little sooner. We engaged with Accenture, their merger and acquisition arm from New York, that said, I know you all are thinking opportunistically an acquisition, a merger. But look, here's a process we go through a building. How can you collaborate from a market perspective? Second tier, how can you collaborate from an operational perspective? How can you and justify each one from whatever your determinants are? For us, it was mission first, and then business second, and it had a weighting system. And then you get to that point, say, oh yeah, we've asked all that, we've looked at all of those things, and so this makes sense. As opposed to, look, this is a really great opportunity. Can you help us make it happen? So we'll probably do that different. Do that. We did that. It was good. I'd do it a little earlier. I don't know. Maybe you guys have.
I guess the thing that surprised me the most was generally how supportive our staff were when they learned. I think we went through a process of engagement once it was sort of underway of letting some of our senior leadership know and kind of bringing them on board. I know that there's obviously some anxiety still. There's still a lot to work out and things, so there's still a bit of wait and see. But people were very excited about it, and I think we think in our sector that we're like our staff will be so afraid it's change. They don't like change, and I think our staff also they know that the world is evolving and changing, and I think they were enthusiastic that this was something done in a kind of a good year, a time when things are like on the upswing, rather than feeling like it was like jumping ship or somehow changing. Then the lesson learned, I think we learned our lesson about kind of investing from some of our early engagements that we undertook, and we did, in fact, we worked with Venable and for a couple of different, 2 or 3 where we invested a lot of legal expenses and it didn't go anywhere. So I think we learned that, and so we ended up using very minimal legal resources until we really needed to, and kind of had it all worked out. So I think that was an important lesson to learn early on, because you could, there aren't a lot of resources at our disposal, so you have to be very strategic about when you bring in the outside counsel. And when you use your both intuition and your own experience and the experience of others.
Yeah, the thing, I was very fortunate. I lived and worked in India for 5 years, so I know India real well, but I'm still surprised. In the sweeping up of these issues about brand and affiliations, that we've been trying to do to bring, a consistent identity to the organization. We have, I think it's 5 different entities in India, right? We have a Grameen Capital India, which is a advisory group on microfinance investing. We have Grameen Impact India, which is an impact investing arm. We have Grameen Foundation India, which is a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary of Grameen Foundation. We have Freedom from Hunger India Trust, which is a nationally governed local charity, and then we just acquired another group that I don't even know the name of. I apologize, right? That has a Brienne could tell us, or my legal counsel here, she could tell, but that has FCRA possibility. For those of you who know India, how important that is, right? So it's partly back to Mark's issue. In affiliations like this, increasingly, particularly in Latin America and Asia. We're operating through affiliates that are locally governed, locally managed, pursuing the mission, in their own way. And it's been a major kind of exercise to try to steer. And on top of that, India is going to become the biggest mobile money place in the world, like in the next 2 years, right? So it would be great to get our act together for that. So that's been, I wouldn't say surprised, maybe bemused would be the word that I'd use, right?
Great. There's another question over here.
Is it working? I'm Cornelia Simpson with URC. Other than obviously increased revenue, what are other self-imposed indicators of success for you in these acquisitions?
Good, I'll start. I think for Humentum, the reason why we did this is we want to reach more people with services, especially outside of the United States, because we think, in a changing sector, how do we make sure that we're getting learning and communities and best practice and peer support to the people who can most benefit from that? So for us, some of our early indicators are on our ability to reach more and our ability over time to be able to measure the difference of that impact specifically. So it's reach turning into specific impact, because our mission now is all about operational excellence, and what we need to be able to do is reach people to help support that and then demonstrate that that's of good value. So those are some of the early indicators that we're looking at. I think there's a bunch of integration indicators, of course, that we're managing around financials and people and organizational health. But I think moving beyond that, it's really looking at, are we making a difference? Does 1 + 1 + 1 equal more than 3 as we look ahead at our merger?
So let's come in from a question from the web. This is for all of the speakers. What response did you get from your stakeholders, your donors, beneficiaries, and your other nonprofit partners? Rebecca?
Yeah, well, we got a lot of responses, although they were very similar. I think the biggest question was, can we still partner with you? Now that you're part of DAI, are you making your partnering decisions, or is DAI? And so I think the sort of partner stakeholders, I think they were kind of most concerned about that. Some of our donors, we're surprised. Some of the, certainly our foundation donors, I think is a little bit of a wait and see. I think, obviously, foundation donors work a lot with for-profits as well, but I think sort of trying to understand, I think it's so unique. I mean, a merger is very clear, it's sort of understood, whereas becoming an affiliate, where does the buck stop, and where are there firewalls in place if we are partnering, that you're actually partnering with IntraHealth and not DAI. So I think that's the biggest area of question, and and I think we're judged on how we act more than what we say, and I think since it's so new, I think people want to see, are you still answering our calls? Are you still calling us to partner? Clearly with the affiliation, I mean, I've talked a lot about how we're independent. One of the things going forward is we really do see DAI as a preferred partner. We do want to work with them when we can, but we know the world is complex, and in any given instance, it might not be appropriate for IntraHealth to be working with them or with DAI working with us, but we don't want to be competing. And we want to, we work very hard. We also have an array of like 20 countries, offices, and working very closely with them to make sure that their donors, their institutional donors, are comfortable and understand. And some are really excited about it. Some of them don't really know, like, who is DAI. Like, there are lots of people in our field who don't know who DAI is. I know in Washington, most people know. And so kind of some education, but it's really probably the partners and the donors that we're kind of getting fairly consistent questions.
Tom, how was your experience, similar or different with the reaction received if you met them?
Yeah, I think as part of our process, part of our diligence process, we had conversations with 35 different leaders across the sector to test what we were trying to do, and also to create some early knowledgeable people who could, as we began to take this journey, could be, supporters of ours. But I think we start from a position of goodwill, earned by the organizations over multiple years. But I think what we're very conscious of is that goodwill has a shelf life, and now what we have to do is begin to show new value and really demonstrate that new value. And in some ways, we keep talking about it as we're re-recruiting people to our purpose and to what we're accomplishing, to being members of ours, to being partners. And that re-recruiting is an important part of what we do over the next year. And, that's where we are, just thinking about how do we re-recruit people to our purpose and show the value.
That's nice. If I could just follow up on Cornelia's question, if that's all right, because I think it's a good question. I think mergers and acquisitions, you start to use the language of for-profit, and so you start to drive to those revenue things. So for us, we're not as good as we should around putting some actual metrics around this. As you know, Cornelia, we run Pact off a balanced scorecard, 17 metrics, overall health of the organization, and one of them obviously is revenue. For not-for-profit, revenue is nothing more than a proxy of your work. Can you serve people? So we at least think about metrics along these three ways and have some around it. We do these to do more, as Tom said. Revenue is a proxy for that. You got more money, do it. But do better. So, for example, with the Artisanal Gold Council, we probably wouldn't have increased our revenue too much, but they would be doing things that we don't know how to do. Mercury and gold, for example. Do better work. People have better skills. And then do different. For example, Pact UK, they think different. The UK government's really big on value for money. US government's not so much. So you get different perspectives. How do you do it different? Like Apple, think different. It's all exposing yourself to stuff that if you're one particular organization, the culture you have, the history you have, the legacy you brought, you think a certain way. So do more, do better, and do different. And I think we can put metrics around that. We're not as good as we should be, but I think there's an opportunity to be.
I know there were some more questions. I saw the gentleman in the glasses over here.
Will Turner with Conservation International. Thanks for these wonderful insights. Seeing the three words up here, alliances, affiliations, and mergers together, sort of begs the question about the relationship between them. And I guess if we could think about them as a continuum farther down into other words you've mentioned, partnership, collaboration, coalitions. How do you know when mergers and acquisitions is the solution to the problem you're trying to solve versus some of these other approaches onto the lighter touches kind of things, the partnership end of things?
Steve, you want to start?
As I mentioned, I guess the flexible organizational structures is really something that's kind of in the DNA of the Grameen movement. if you follow Muhammad Yunus in his writing now, he's really talking a lot about social business, and it's building on microfinance, but how business practices can essentially address issues related to poverty and do it in a sustainable way. And so, the exercise for us is more, and even after the merger with Freedom from Hunger, it's more about what is currently maybe project funded or current kind of soft money financed, that we have the opportunity to to spawn as a sustainable enterprise. And the enterprise could be strictly for profit. We do have a number of equity holdings in a number of countries that are bottom of the pyramid related businesses that reflect work that we do or we have done that are simply for profit, and now have their own boards, leadership, equity base, et cetera. But if you go back 8 or 10 years ago, they were a project in the Grameen world. So it's very much part of like the core strategy that we have to look at how what we currently do can become sustained in an enterprise, for profit or not. So that that's kind of the DNA for us. The merger with Freedom from Hunger was a lever really to do more of that. Grameen had relationships with 500-600 microfinance institutions that it had financed and known over time. Freedom from Hunger had its own large universe. There was a regional kind of complementarity between the two. But when you got further in it, both organizations were deploying mobile technology a lot. Freedom from Hunger more, frankly, on the didactic training side. Freedom from Hunger does have a social enterprise in Latin America that basically uses mobile devices and e-learning to train field agents and microfinance organizations in Latin America. It's gone very well. It's called Propel. Grameen's expertise was more on how technology impacts clients' access to finance and practices and behavior, and how it impacts extension workers and their ability to function well. It also has done a lot of work on enterprise technology in the finance sector. So, the core competencies of both organizations essentially were very aligned to, the core work of trying to spawn, sustainable enterprises that continue to serve the poor. Right. That was, I think, kind of a basic kind of tenet that both organizations shared, and there was a recognition that it could be leveraged much more. So, I spent a lot of time working in CARE, for example, and with an organization like CARE, which was much more project related, project financed, it was harder to determine a life beyond the project, right? And I think one of the things that really has attracted me to where a group like Grameen is now is that that's the core kind of mission of it, is to find how the value that's created with soft financing can be sustained later. And we make no apologies for the fact that we do cash out regularly, and that helps us to recycle resources. So.
Sometimes the law of foreign jurisdictions can also play a role in the structuring of a transaction. And Tom and Mark, could you perhaps comment on Pact UK and?
Yeah, I want to follow up a little bit what Tom said, because I think it's a great question. And this may sound like a linguistic insignificance, but we generally try to pursue them not to solve a problem, but to operationalize an opportunity we can't find another way to do. Now, it sounds really simple, and it probably is, but just your mindset, right? So we're not trying to solve something through it, because as Tom talked about, once you do this, it takes up a lot of time and a lot of distraction from the good work the organization is trying to do. Can't underestimate that, and it's unavoidable. So I don't think you can get an impermeable wall. It's going to affect the organization if you're taking one in or building a new one. So don't do it lightly. I would say, from our experience, don't do a merger and acquisition up the formal side of the chain that we're talking about here, unless that's really the only way, or clearly, from metrics perspective, the best way to operationalize the opportunity you're seeking. Because there's a lot of distraction, there's a lot of cost, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of senior leadership time, either with the board, you get stuck in the middle, right? You're with the board, and then maybe some external media, and then staff. And if you're out in the field, to the extent that you work with local community-based groups, that's another thing you got to deal with. So it can be a distraction. McKinsey, KPMG, and Accenture all have sort of this ladder approach. Real good set of questions that you define what you're looking at from your value set and march you through them. And so there's an actual process you can go through. I think to the point before is where Tom talked about, and what Steve talked about. What do you want in the beginning before you even engage with them? What does that look like? What's that opportunity? Who are you? Who do you want? What do you want to, in a sense, change into by getting somebody or giving yourself up to? And then you can engage them. But there is a rigorous formal process.
It came down, I think, in a very simple question for our boards, 3 boards, which was, if we take this form of affiliation, merger, does it accelerate our strategy and the realization of results?
Yeah.
That was the acid test question. And if we could answer that and prove that, I think each board was very comfortable moving ahead, and we were comfortable moving ahead as well, compared to other alternatives.
A question here.
Good morning. I'm Scott Conrad with Hub International. We're a global insurance brokerage and risk advisory firm. I work with a number of Humentum's members and with Humentum itself. Every one of these situations brings both opportunity and risk. And I'm wondering how the discipline of risk management factored into your process, perhaps on an enterprise-wide basis, to look at all the different risks that are involved in any one of these variations, an alliance, an affiliation, or a merger, and how you actually went about looking at risk. Thanks.
Rebecca?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about a couple of risks. One, I briefly mentioned about the risk to being able to continue to engage with our current donors and clients and partners. I think, and we were very careful, at least from the beginning to where we are now, in terms of a very detailed process of reaching out and communicating actively, openly, transparently as much as we can. The other risk is just an ongoing, is to protect our nonprofit status. And our board is, we're now, from being an independent not-for-profit, being a sole member not-for-profit, of which the member can appoint sort of a small majority of the board members. But there's certain legal, we just have to protect so that if we're fully owned and controlled, then we're no longer not-for-profit, or we have some risks there. So I think that the way it was designed was carefully laid out, and working very closely with our attorneys, and DAI has in-house counsel to work out. And that also plays out in terms of our management services agreement. And one of the things that we're still working on, we want to be able to both ways, and also in a give and take, and offering services and accepting them rather than being one way, both back-end services as well as on projects, so that either on new programs that we bid out or on existing that we could, there's really nice, again, complementarity, like we can get a, governance expertise. And we can't do this yet, we're working it out, but get it at a way that it's not going to be too expensive on either side to be able to, or that there's some advantageous to do it rather than overly cost prohibitive. I think those two are sort of our big kind of risks that we're trying to mitigate.
From an enterprise perspective, I mean, that's the key, right? And so we're fortunate enough that we have an enterprise risk framework across the enterprise that looks at a risk profile around 16 vectors, and then we develop a risk appetite. And then there's a continuum around where we want to be, not each one, but cumulative, more reds than yellows and greens, where are we, right? And we're able to talk amongst ourselves about that. But then with the board, as I mentioned, we're able to do these opportunistic tactical plays because the board got to a point where we're seeing ourselves as an asset, and risk was part of that. So like a lot of you, we have a F&A committee, finance and audit committee. A lot of those guys, eat risk for breakfast. That's all they think about. And so that was a great way to engage with this risk perspective, since management gets eventually at a point where they get excited about the opportunity, because you answered the question that Tom said, yes, we believe this will perpetuate our mission more vibrantly. So you need that other perspective. So our board provided that for us, and so we were very transparent with the board. And we sort of categorized our risks basically into 2 areas. Operational risk, which is generally management's concern, but not to have the conversation with ourselves, but then present those risks. Did we identify the right ones? Do we have a mitigatory plan? Have we parsed the scale and scope of it correctly? The board would be the judge and jury on that. and then governance risk. And the board is really around that. And they would engage with management as well, because we know, for example, reputation is in both of those camps, right? So what does that look like? So we used our risk, enterprise risk framework we had and our risk appetite as a baseline, and then specified operational and governance risks and took a look at it.
There's a question in the middle here.
Kevin Murphy, president of J.E. Austin Associates. We've done 600 projects over 30 years in about 127 countries, but we're in the corporate space. So since the title is Trends in International Development, I thought I'd talk a little bit about maybe the corporate side or raise some questions, but I do have some specific questions for the panelists. We've seen Tetra Tech acquire ARD and MSI. We've seen Palladium acquire Karana and DTS. We've seen Cardno acquire EMG. We've seen IRG get acquired first by Agility and then by RTI. So if you look at and there have been many others, if you look at those and you ask yourself what are the trends, it would seem like there are two. One is that there really is a missing middle. So because the procurements are larger, it's really a business on that side. You need to be a DAI or a Tetra Tech or a Chemonics large to mount multifaceted proposals for relatively large sums of money. So at the small end, you have small business set-asides, but once you get into the middle range, it's harder to survive, and you see a lot of acquisitions taking place in that space. The second is the geographic diversification. So folks who are in London or Australia or the U.S. want to play in the other venues, and so you see acquisitions taking place there. The Agility one, the DDD, you know, the development, diplomacy, and defense, that seemed like it was going to be a thing where companies wanted to acquire capabilities. I think that's sort of spent. I don't see that happening. And in the case of Agility, of course, they've now gotten rid of their development company. So I would like to ask Humentum if you have seen any trends, or in advising your members, you've seen any lessons from the largest acquisition in the NGO space, that of AED by FHI 360. Are there some lessons there? That was just huge. And also maybe an NGO, Research Triangle Institute, has just acquired the remnants of IRG from Agility, and if you see some lessons there, I think it'd be a great topic for Humentum to follow up on and have even more sharing about this. You know, for Rebecca, you know, the indirect rates of NGOs, I was surprised. We also have an NGO, you know, maybe 0.15 to 0.28. And the indirect rates for companies, although we don't count a lot of things that you guys count, you know, is 2, you know, either side of 2, you know, 1.8 to 2 point something. And I suspect is DAI's major interest in having you affiliated, they can't control you, obviously, so that they can actually gin up business on the corporate side and really, you know, sort of find things to do that could go over the transfer from your side over to the corporate side, so they would be able to actually meet some of their other jobs. And finally, for Venable, do you guys actually do work for companies who are have you done M&A work in the international development space for companies? Just truth in advertising, we've been on the receiving end of maybe 9 offers, which we've successfully deflected up until now. 2 of those have since gone bankrupt. So we're very happy with our decisions to plug ahead as we are. Thank you.
Good. I will jump in a couple different things. It's funny you mentioned you know, the creation of FHI 360. We have an integration committee of our board, and one of the members of that integration committee, she's not a board member, but she's on the committee. She's on the FHI 360 board and was involved in that transaction. So having the benefit of that example, and I think that's an interesting point for us as a sector, because if you start to think about it, there are now, and you listed several different, and this panel represents several different examples. And I think there's a learning that's taking place, that we're on an experience curve where there are more creative and innovative combinations, and there's lessons learned and successes shared about, you know, how to merge. I think if we look more broadly, we would expect this activity would continue. And I think what makes it possible, you know, are probably 2 different things. One, we talked about these are long processes. You use advisors. You have to use unrestricted funding. So having currency, unrestricted funding that allows you to investigate, explore, and consummate successfully mergers will be important. The second thing that we also see as Humentum is that to get true scale benefits, often you have to have good operational capabilities. And we believe those who invest in good operations, be that finance, HR, IT, legal, the whole gamut, you're able to be, in some cases, a better acquirer, and you're able to create a true platform that allows you to affiliate with a variety of different organizations if you have that infrastructure in place. So we would see that this will continue, but there's a couple of important drivers around having the right funding to do it well, and then having the right internal operational capacity to execute and create the scale value successfully.
I'll answer your question. I don't think DAI is anticipating. I think we do have different cost structures, and we'll keep them going forward. I think some of the areas that DI was most excited about, they have a small, I think they're known, many of you might know, they've been involved in the global health security agenda since avian flu and really the evolution. So that's really what they're known in the health space. And they're not so known outside of that. They also just acquired a UK firm, Health Partners International. They did that a couple months before announcing our affiliation, and that is a small consulting firm out of UK, so they're also dealing with the kind of differences organizationally that brings, but they bring some similar health systems capes. I think if I could speak, what I've heard DAI say is they really are seeing this kind of family of organizations as sort of a social enterprise with some, there's the DAI, there's kind of groups sort of on the outer rings that are sort of still part of the family but less controlled. And I think what they see is more the market share that now that we're affiliated with them, they're likely to be able to bid with with us or without us, given this area. So really for them, it's being known. I think they've been in all the other sectors in USAID and with other donors as well. They've actually successfully, I think, I don't know the exact percentages, but in a very short number of years have a huge minority of their funding is from the UK, from DFID, and so they've really managed to diversify. So I think our coming along isn't going to necessarily change their cost structure. It might, over time, strengthen ours so that there could be areas of sort of value for money or efficiencies. We're not necessarily, from the get-go, looking at integration and loss of, say, duplication of staff functions yet, but over time we see that will make us more competitive.
We have time for one more question, if there are any in the audience here.
Excuse me. Good morning. My name is Erin Kennedy. I'm with Child Fund International. This has been fantastic. Thank you all for this event. My question is just thinking about how much time, energy, resources all of this takes, and how there's also pressures from all around to do this sort of adventure. I would love to kind of hear, when do you know you need to pull out? Like what were the key signs that you felt like this really isn't going anywhere, even though there are kind of some benefits to it? I'm just interested in how you know not to move forward, and any advice you have for all of us thinking about this. Thank you.
Mark, you want to take that one?
Sure. I wish there was a little sheet you could get off the web that would tell you, maybe someone can Google it as we're talking. But
Go, no go.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a little test. I think part of it is, depending what your motivation is, it depends, right? But for us, speaking from my experience, as I mentioned, we put, mission and values, two different things, and we have some criteria around that. When you start to see conversations getting more divergent, and not in an episodic way, because that's going to happen, but in a trending way, then it's time to not necessarily pull out, but pull back and reevaluate with a third party, Venerable, Accenture, your board, a trusted executive, somebody, and just reevaluate. So what are we seeing here, right? We probably should have done that with Artisanal Gold Council, right? But we wanted to do it so much, we were really convinced of the business case. They balked at the very last minute. And by the last minute, I mean the night before, right? By sending a letter, even though we had paid for them to come, instead of doing it face-to-face. Obviously, there was something going on that they wouldn't even come, even though the ticket was paid. Something's going on. How did we miss that? We didn't put in place those sort of points where you can evaluate. And that's that earlier comment and question around intuition. I wouldn't say it's intuition, but it's taking sort of the interpersonal understanding of, that's a good 40-50% of this, right? The interpersonal understanding, appreciating that, putting it in its right context, and then finding out a way to, from an actions perspective, put it in a business context, right? So I would say that. The other thing would be, on another side, we have a mission one as well, a different transaction, not to talk too much about, but when just the friction gets so much, when you're down to, because we're down to the legal things right now, right? There's 4 legal things you have to do. Each one's a separate agreement. When the friction is so great that you're finding yourselves not negotiating the intent of the paragraph, the intent, but you're negotiating the word or trying to protect X or Y, then you got to pull back and reevaluate. Because that hints at different things. I don't know if that's your guys' experience.
I know there were a lot of other questions, so I'm sure you'll be able to catch Rebecca, Steve, Tom, and Mark on their way out. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. Also wanted to thank Elizabeth Walsh and the rest of the Humentum team for helping make today a possibility, and of course to our audience for coming out on a brisk Monday morning in December. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.